On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted regular television programming to make an announcement that most Americans assumed was about Vietnam. It was a Sunday night. People were watching Bonanza. And in the space of 18 minutes, without a vote in Congress, without a public debate, and without most viewers understanding what they were hearing, the financial foundation of the entire modern world was permanently changed. Nixon called it a temporary measure. He said it was necessary to protect the American dollar against international speculators. He promised it would stabilize the economy. He spoke with complete confidence. And then he ended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold, a monetary anchor that had existed in some form for nearly a century, and walked off camera. The measure was never reversed. What Nixon called temporary became permanent. And what happened to money on that Sunday evening in August 1971 is the single most consequential financial event of the modern era that most ordinary people have never had properly explained to them. Because here is what changed. Not in theory, not in some abstract economic sense, but in practical, personal, immediate terms that affected every dollar you would ever earn, save, or spend from that day forward. Before August 15, 1971, the US dollar was a specific kind of promise. Under the Bretton Woods system established after World War II, the dollar was convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other countries held dollars as their primary reserve currency precisely because those dollars could be exchanged for real gold at a guaranteed price. The dollar was not just paper. It was a claim, a legal entitlement to a specific quantity of physical precious metal held in the vaults of the United States government. This meant that the amount of money in circulation was, at least in principle, constrained by how much gold the United States actually had. You could not simply print unlimited dollars because every dollar in existence was theoretically backed by gold in Fort Knox. The physical supply of metal put a ceiling on monetary expansion. And that ceiling, while imperfect and frequently bent, created a form of discipline in the monetary system that kept long-run inflation relatively contained. After August 15, 1971, the dollar became something fundamentally different. It became what economists call a fiat currency. A currency whose value rests not on any physical commodity but on institutional trust, government declaration, and market confidence. Your paper bills and bank deposits remained legal money. Nobody took them away from you, but they were no longer promises to deliver gold on demand. They were promises backed by nothing except the continued functioning and credibility of the institutions that issued them. Nixon did not announce this clearly. He spoke about protecting the dollar, stabilizing the international monetary system, and defending American workers. He never said the words that would have made the announcement immediately alarming to ordinary people. He never said, "From tonight, the money in your wallet is no longer backed by gold. It is backed by trust, and trust, unlike gold, can be manufactured in unlimited quantities." But that is exactly what he said, in the language of monetary policy rather than plain English, and the consequences began unfolding almost immediately. The first consequence was visible within 2 years. Fixed exchange rates, which had anchored international trade and made the global economy predictable since Bretton Woods, began collapsing. By 1973, most major currencies had moved to floating exchange rates, meaning their values now fluctuated against each other based on market forces, speculation, capital flows, and policy decisions rather than fixed ratios anchored by gold. International trade became more flexible. It also became more volatile. And for ordinary companies doing business across borders, a new and expensive problem emerged: foreign exchange risk. The uncertainty of not knowing what your foreign revenues would be worth when converted back to your home currency. This uncertainty spawned an entire new industry of currency hedging, derivatives, and financial products designed to manage exchange rate exposure. An industry that now turns over trillions of dollars per day and exists almost entirely because of a decision made on a Sunday night in 1971. The second consequence was the one most ordinary people felt most directly: inflation. In the decade following 1971, inflation across the United States and most of the developed world accelerated to levels that the post-war generation had never experienced. By the late 1970s, U.S. inflation had reached double digits. The purchasing power of the dollar that ordinary Americans had earned and saved was being eroded at a rate that made long-term financial planning almost impossible. Interest rates were eventually raised to extraordinary levels by Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, reaching nearly 20% in 1981 to break the inflationary cycle. The cure was nearly as painful as the disease. Unemployment spiked. A severe recession followed. And ordinary people who had done everything right, saved their money, planned for retirement, trusted the system, found that the dollars they had carefully accumulated were worth significantly less than the dollars they had originally earned. Here is the connection that most people never make. The inflation of the 1970s was not caused by oil shocks alone, though the oil shocks made it worse. It was enabled by the removal of the monetary constraint that gold convertibility had imposed. When money no longer needed to be backed by a physical commodity in limited supply, governments and central banks gained the ability to expand the money supply more easily during economic downturns. That flexibility was the explicit justification for ending gold convertibility. It allowed policymakers to respond to crises without being constrained by how much gold they had in the vault. But flexibility in money creation is, by definition, the capacity to create inflation. And once that capacity exists without a hard constraint, the temptation to use it, especially during political pressure, election cycles, or economic emergencies, becomes almost irresistible. This is the mechanism that most finance content never explains clearly. The gold standard was not perfect. It had real costs. Mining and storing gold to support money issuance consumed real resources. The system was vulnerable to short-term shocks and output swings. And the rules of the game that were supposed to govern how countries managed their gold reserves had been bent and broken for years before 1971. With countries sterilizing gold flows and running balance of payments deficits that the system was never designed to accommodate indefinitely. The breakdown of 1971 had been building for years. The U.S. had been running deficits that steadily drained its gold reserves since the 1960s. Foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, had been aggressively converting their dollar reserves into physical gold, essentially calling America's bluff on the $35 peg. By August 1971, the vault was running low. Nixon's announcement was not a bold policy choice. It was a managed retreat from a position that had already become militarily untenable. But the retreat created a new world. And in that new world, the rules that govern your money, how much of it exists, what it is worth, how much of your labor it can buy, are no longer constrained by any physical limit. They are managed by institutions. By central banks. By policy committees that meet 8 times a year and make decisions that ripple through every price in every economy on Earth. And those institutions, while staffed by genuinely intelligent and dedicated people, operate under pressures, political, economic, and institutional, that do not always align with the interests of ordinary savers. Consider what happened to the dollar's purchasing power after 1971 compared to before. In the roughly 30 years between 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, and 1971, the dollar lost approximately half its purchasing power. In the roughly 50 years since 1971, the dollar has lost approximately 85% of its purchasing power. The rate of erosion accelerated significantly after the gold constraint was removed. This is not a coincidence. It is the predictable mathematical consequence of moving from a system where money creation was constrained by a physical commodity to a system where money creation is constrained only by institutional judgment and political will. And here is the part that connects directly to the financial lives of people alive today. The shift to fiat currency did not affect everyone equally. Just as the Roman currency debasement we examined in an earlier video redistributed wealth from cash savers to landholders, the post-1971 monetary system has systematically redistributed wealth from people who save in cash to people who hold assets. Every period of significant money supply expansion, 2008, 2020, 2021, has produced the same result. Asset prices rise, the stock market rises, real estate prices rise, and the people who hold those assets become wealthier in nominal terms, while ordinary savers find that the purchasing power of their cash deposits quietly erodes. The person who saved diligently in a bank account between 1971 and 2021 and kept their money in cash or low-yield deposits effectively subsidized the wealth accumulation of people who held stocks and real estate, not through any deliberate choice, but through the structural mechanics of a monetary system that rewards asset ownership and penalizes cash holding in ways that were never clearly explained to them. Nixon promised the end of gold convertibility was temporary. He promised it would protect ordinary Americans. He promised stability. Instead, it created the floating exchange rate system, the inflation of the 1970s, the financialization of the global economy, the explosion in derivatives and currency speculation, and a 50-year trend of monetary expansion that has consistently and predictably benefited those closest to the financial system at the expense of those furthest from it. The US dollar remained the world's primary reserve currency after 1971, not because it was backed by gold, but because no alternative existed that could replace the depth and liquidity of dollar-denominated financial markets. The dollar's reserve status became self-reinforcing. Countries needed dollars to buy oil, to trade internationally, to hold as foreign exchange reserves. And that demand gave the United States an extraordinary privilege, the ability to run deficits and print money in ways that would have collapsed any other currency, that has never been formally acknowledged or explained to the ordinary American taxpayer who implicitly underwrites it. When people say today that money is backed by trust, they are describing something real. The modern monetary system rests on institutional credibility, policy competence, and market confidence rather than on metal in a vault. That is genuinely true. But what they rarely say, what is almost never said clearly in any mainstream financial conversation, is that trust, unlike gold, can be created in unlimited quantities. And a system built on unlimited trust creation, managed by institutions operating under political pressure, will always be tempted to create more of it than is strictly necessary. And every time it does, the people who pay the price are the ones who save in cash, earn wages, and trust that the number on their paycheck means what it says. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon interrupted Bonanza to change the rules. He called it temporary. He called it protective. He said it was for the American worker. What it actually was the moment the last physical constraint on money creation was removed, the moment your dollar stopped being a claim on something real and became a claim on institutional confidence. The moment the financial system gained a freedom it has never voluntarily relinquished. The vault has been open since August 15, 1971. The question is whether you were ever meant to understand what Nixon actually changed that Sunday night.